Welcome to The Thinking Shelf, the podcast where timeless philosophies meet modern living. Here we explore the ideas that have shaped human thought for centuries, diving into the profound wisdom of world philosophies like Zen, Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, and more. Each episode is your invitation to pause, reflect, and rediscover life's deeper meaning, whether it's through ancient teachings, meditative practices, or thought-provoking discussions. Pull up a seat, settle your mind, and let's begin another conversation from The Thinking Shelf.
Welcome to a deep dive into a book that's considered a classic, and for good reason, Gandhi's Autobiography. You know, it really struck me that he didn't just, write about the events of his life. He framed it as the story of my experiments with truth, which is fascinating.
What's fascinating is that Gandhi viewed his whole life as a laboratory.
Oh, wow.
For understanding truth.
Yeah.
And that makes his story surprisingly relevant, even today.
It really does. We're going to be exploring excerpts from his book alongside some historical context just to understand his journey. And honestly, there are some pretty incredible stories in here. We're talking childhood mischief, a rebellious phase that involved eating meat.
Oh, wow.
And even getting thrown off a train in South Africa for wearing a turban.
The question of truth was like his guiding light through it all.
Yeah.
Gandhi was constantly grappling with questions like, how do we live truthfully? How do our personal choices reflect our values? And how do we fight for justice without compromising our principles? And these are questions that we still wrestle with today.
Absolutely. They're timeless. And something that really struck me is that Gandhi wasn't born a saint. You know, his autobiography reveals that he was a complex person.
Right.
With flaws.
Yeah.
And struggles, just like all of us.
You see that right from the beginning.
Yeah.
In his descriptions of his childhood in India, his father was a government official, known for his honesty, strong sense of duty. Those values clearly influenced Gandhi.
Yeah.
But his path wasn't always easy.
You're right. He shares an anecdote about a spelling test where he couldn't bring himself to copy from his classmates, even though the teacher encouraged him to. It's remarkable.
That really speaks to his early commitment to honesty.
Yeah.
Even when it meant, standing out or potentially facing negative consequences. It's a recurring theme, this unwavering dedication to what he believed to be true.
It makes you wonder, has there ever been a time in your life when you had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what you knew was right?
Oh, yeah.
How did you navigate that decision? It's interesting to think about those moments where our integrity is tested.
Definitely. And as Gandhi grew older, he faced even more complex moral dilemmas.
Okay.
For instance, he was married at the age of 13.
13.
Which was a common custom at the time.
Wow.
But something he later questioned.
I can't imagine being married at that age.
Right.
How did he reconcile that experience with his evolving views on marriage and relationships?
He writes about struggling to balance his personal desires with his sense of duty as a husband.
Yeah.
Especially in those early years. He was honest about his shortcomings and even admitted to moments of jealousy and controlling behavior.
It's refreshing to see that kind of honesty.
Yeah.
Especially in someone who's often placed on a pedestal. It makes his story even more relatable. He wasn't perfect, he was constantly learning and growing.
Exactly. He even tells a story about stealing a bit of coral from his brother and being consumed by guilt.
Oh, wow.
Ultimately, he confessed to his father in writing, unable to bear the weight of the lie.
It seems that even from a young age, he was acutely aware of the consequences of dishonesty, even in seemingly small matters.
That awareness shaped his path, even as he embarked on a journey to England to study law, which exposed him to a whole new world and set of challenges.
Talk about a culture shock. Going from a traditional Indian upbringing to Victorian England must have been a huge adjustment. What were some of the biggest challenges he faced?
He encountered prejudice. Struggled to maintain his vegetarian diet in a place where vegetarianism was practically unheard of, and even attempted to fit in by becoming an English gentleman.
Oh, wow.
He took violin lessons, worked on his accent, and tried to adopt their customs.
That's interesting. It seems like he was trying to find his place in a new culture.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that wasn't his true self.
It highlights his willingness to experiment, to try on different identities. But ultimately, he realized the importance of staying true to his own values and sense of self.
It's a valuable lesson for anyone navigating different cultural environments or even just trying to figure out who they are.
It was during this time that he solidified his commitment to vegetarianism. He came across a book by Henry Salt arguing for the ethical treatment of animals, and it deeply resonated with him.
So it wasn't just about diet for him. It was about aligning his actions with his beliefs about nonviolence. Did that experience lay the groundwork for his philosophy of satyagraha?
It certainly played a role. The concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence, became a core principle for him, extending to all living beings. And his time in England also revealed his commitment to honesty, as shown when he confessed to a woman he was courting that he was already married.
That must have taken a lot of courage.
Indeed, he prioritized honesty and transparency, even when it was difficult.
So after his period of self-discovery in England, he ends up in South Africa for work, and that's where his story takes a dramatic turn, right?
Yes, that's where he came face to face with the brutal realities of racism and discrimination. This experience became a turning point in his life and ultimately shaped his path as a leader.
I'm ready to hear about this. What were some of the defining moments of his time in South Africa?
Well, one of the most well-known incidents is when he was thrown off a train for refusing to move to the third-class compartment.
Wow.
Even though he had a first-class ticket, all because he was wearing a turban.
Wow. I can only imagine the humiliation and injustice he must have felt. To be treated that way simply because of his appearance, it's a stark reminder of the prejudice that existed and sadly still exists in some forms today.
It would have been easy to react with anger or even violence, but Gandhi chose a different path, a path that would ultimately change the course of history.
I'm eager to hear how he responded to this experience and how it shaped his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. So he's facing this blatant discrimination, but instead of meeting it with violence, he chooses a different path. I'm really curious to learn more about how his philosophy of satyagraha developed.
Yeah, this is where satyagraha truly begins to take shape.
Sure.
It's often translated as truth force or soul force, and it goes beyond passive resistance. It's about actively resisting injustice.
Okay.
But with truth and love as the driving forces, the goal isn't to defeat your opponent, but to appeal to their conscience and ultimately convert them.
It's a powerful idea, especially considering the violent world he was living in. It seems like a radical departure from the norm.
It was radical,
Yeah.
and his commitment to it was tested time and again. He was even beaten by a mob
Wow.
for speaking out against the treatment of Indians in South Africa. But instead of pressing charges, he chose to forgive his attackers.
That's incredible. It must have taken immense strength to respond to violence with forgiveness.
It speaks to his unwavering belief in the power of nonviolence, even in the face of extreme provocation. He was constantly putting his principles into practice, even when it was dangerous or difficult.
It makes you think about how we respond to conflict in our own lives. It's easy to get caught up in anger or resentment, but Gandhi's example challenges us to consider a different approach.
Absolutely. And his approach wasn't limited to individual actions. He went on to form the Natal Indian Congress,
Okay.
organizing the Indian community to fight for their rights through non-violent means. This is a crucial step in his evolution as a leader.
So he's taking on this leadership role, putting his philosophy into action on a larger scale. Were there any particular challenges or setbacks he faced during this period?
There were many. Leading a movement for social change is never easy. He faced opposition from the authorities, internal conflicts within the Indian community, and even moments of self-doubt. He recounts an incident where a police officer pushed him off the sidewalk for no reason.
Wow.
These experiences constantly tested his commitment to nonviolence.
It's important to remember that he wasn't a superhuman figure who never faltered. He was a human being grappling with complex situations, constantly striving to live up to his ideals.
Exactly. And amidst these external struggles, he was also engaging in personal experiments, pushing his own boundaries.
Okay.
He established a communal farm called Tolstoy Farm,
Oh, wow.
embracing a life of simplicity and self-sufficiency.
I'm intrigued by this idea of Tolstoy Farm. What was his vision for this community and what lessons did he learn from that experience?
Tolstoy Farm was inspired by the writings of Leo Tolstoy, who advocated for a simple, agrarian lifestyle. Gandhi saw it as a way to put his ideals into practice,
Okay.
living in a community based on self-reliance, equality, and nonviolent principles. It was a laboratory for exploring a different way of life.
It sounds like a radical departure from the conventional life he could have led as a lawyer. What were some of the key lessons he took away from that experience?
He learned a great deal about the practicalities of community living, the importance of self-discipline, and the power of shared purpose. He also experimented with different forms of satyagraha, including fasting as a form of penance when some of the young people under his care made mistakes.
Fasting as a punishment for others' actions. That seems like a rather extreme practice.
It does seem extreme to us today, but it reflects his deep sense of responsibility for those under his care and his unwavering belief in the power of self-sacrifice as a means of atonement. He wasn't just preaching these ideas, he was embodying them, even when it meant pushing himself to the limit.
It makes you wonder about the role of self-sacrifice in leadership. It's certainly a complex and challenging concept.
It is, and it's one that he continued to explore throughout his life.
So we see him evolving from this shy kid who couldn't cheat on a test, to a lawyer, to a community organizer, and now to a leader willing to push himself to the limit for his beliefs. But his journey doesn't end in South Africa. He eventually returns to India, where a whole new chapter unfolds.
His experiences in South Africa laid the foundation for his leadership, shaped his philosophy, but his return to India marked a new phase in his life.
What were some of the key factors that prompted his return, and what awaited him in India?
He was urged to return by Gopal Krishna Gokhale, a prominent Indian political leader who became a mentor to Gandhi.
Okay.
Gokhale saw the potential in Gandhi and believed he had a crucial role to play in India's struggle for independence.
So he returns to India with this newfound experience and a powerful philosophy. It's almost like the perfect preparation for the challenges he was about to face.
It was. He arrived at a pivotal moment in India's history, a time of growing unrest and a yearning for freedom from British rule. He was ready to apply the lessons he had learned and lead the nation on a new path.
It sounds like he was stepping onto a much larger stage. What were some of the key issues and challenges he addressed upon his return to India?
He immersed himself in the fight for independence, advocating for nonviolent resistance as the most effective way to achieve Swaraj, or self-rule. He also confronted the issue of untouchability,
Right.
a deeply ingrained social evil that he saw as a violation of basic human dignity.
That's a powerful example of how he connected his personal beliefs about nonviolence and truth to broader social issues. He wasn't afraid to tackle difficult and systemic problems.
Exactly. He saw all forms of injustice as interconnected. He believed that achieving true freedom required addressing not just political oppression, but also social and economic inequalities. And amidst all of this, he continued his personal experiments, particularly with diet and fasting.
I remember reading about his various dietary experiments. He gave up milk, explored a fruitarian diet, and practiced prolonged fasting. What was the motivation behind these practices?
They were deeply connected to his spiritual beliefs and his pursuit of brahmacharya, which encompasses celibacy and self-control.
Okay.
He saw these practices as a way to purify himself, strengthen his resolve, and cultivate inner peace.
Brahmachari, that's a concept I'm not entirely familiar with. Could you elaborate on what it meant to Gandhi and how it influenced his approach to life?
Brahmacharya, for Gandhi, was about much more than just celibacy. It was about mastering one's desires, channeling energy towards higher pursuits, and living a life of self-discipline and service to others. It was a core principle that guided his actions and decisions.
So it wasn't just a personal practice, but something that informed his leadership and his vision for a better world.
Absolutely. He believed that personal transformation was essential for social transformation. He couldn't advocate for nonviolence and self-control in the world if he wasn't embodying those principles himself.
Right.
His dietary choices and fasting were all part of this larger effort.
It's fascinating how he integrated his personal beliefs and practices into his public life and his work for social change.
He saw them as inseparable. He believed that true leadership stemmed from inner strength and a commitment to living in alignment with one's values.
It makes you think about the qualities we look for in leaders today, and how often those qualities are defined by external achievements rather than inner character.
Gandhi's example challenges us to reconsider what constitutes true leadership, and to recognize the importance of inner work alongside outward action.
His life is a testament to the power of personal transformation as a catalyst for social change. It's a reminder that real change begins with ourselves, with our own choices and actions.
And that's a message that resonates deeply, even today.
It's amazing how he connected all these aspects of his life, like his personal beliefs, his dietary choices, his commitment to nonviolence. It's all interwoven.
It's a holistic approach.
Yeah.
He saw the interconnectedness of all things and believed that true change had to happen on multiple levels, both internal and external.
Yeah.
And one of the ways this manifested was in his embrace of khadi.
Right, khadi. He became known for wearing the simple homespun cloth. I'm curious, was this just about personal style, or was there a deeper meaning behind it?
Oh, it was much more than just clothing. Khadi represented self-reliance and a rejection of British-made goods. By wearing khadi, Gandhi was making a statement about economic independence and supporting local artisans. It became a symbol of resistance and a way to promote Swadeshi.
Swadeshi, that's a new term for me. What does that concept encompass?
Swadeshi essentially means self-sufficiency, but it goes beyond that. It's about promoting local production, supporting Indian industries, and fostering a sense of national pride and unity. It was a key element of Gandhi's vision for an independent India.
So it was about reclaiming their economic and cultural power by supporting their own communities. It's like he was saying, we can create the change we want to see by making conscious choices about what we consume and how we live our lives.
Exactly. And he didn't just wear khadi, he learned to spin it himself, encouraging others to do the same. He saw it as a way to connect with the people, to promote simplicity, and to demonstrate that real change starts with individual actions.
There's that theme again. Personal action leading to larger social transformation. He wasn't just waiting for someone else to fix the problems. He was taking matters into his own hands, starting with himself.
He led by example. And his commitment to khadi was unwavering. He even issued an ultimatum to one of his followers, saying he would only wear khadi from then on, even if it meant wearing a shorter or coarser garment. It was a powerful symbol of his dedication to his principles.
Wow. He was really putting his beliefs into action. It's a reminder that our choices, even seemingly small ones, can reflect our values and contribute to a larger movement for change.
It's about aligning our actions with our principles, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. And Gandhi demonstrated this time and again.
His story is so inspiring, but I have to admit some of his practices like prolonged fasting seem extreme. What was the role of fasting in his life, and how did he use it as a tool for social change?
Fasting, for Gandhi, was a deeply spiritual practice. It was a way to purify himself, to strengthen his resolve, and to draw attention to injustices. He believed it could awaken the conscience of his opponents and appeal to their sense of humanity.
So it wasn't just about personal purification, but also about creating a moral pressure for change.
Exactly. He used fasting strategically during critical moments in the independence movement. For example, he fasted to protest violence between Hindus and Muslims, urging them to find common ground and work together for peace. His fasts often had a profound impact, galvanizing people and forcing those in power to confront their actions.
It was a form of nonviolent resistance that put his own life on the line. It must have taken incredible courage and conviction.
It did, and it highlights the lengths he was willing to go to for his beliefs. He believed that true change often requires sacrifice, and whose ideas evolved over time. So let's start by going back to 1915. Gandhi returns to India after years of activism in South Africa. What's fascinating is how he was celebrated, almost like a conquering hero, praised for, quote-unquote, solving the issue of Indian nationality in South Africa, which is kind of crazy because back in India, the Indian National Congress was still grappling with the very same issue.
It's like he brought a playbook back with him, right? But here's the thing, this return to India wasn't all sunshine and roses. Gandhi's relationship with his eldest son, Harlal, was pretty strained, to say the least.
Yeah, and we often hear about Gandhi's emphasis on selflessness, but how did that play out in his own family life?
That's where we start to see the cracks in that idealized image. Harlal had his own ambitions, and these ambitions directly clashed with his father's expectations, to the point where in March 1915, right after their reunion, they had a huge falling out, and Gandhi actually cut off all financial support to his son.
Wow, I mean, that's a tough decision for any parent to make. It makes you wonder if this clash was a kind of foreshadowing of the larger challenges Gandhi would face, trying to balance his own personal beliefs with the complexities of leading a nationwide movement.
Absolutely, and it highlights those sacrifices that come with dedicating your life to such a grand vision. This tension between the personal and the political, that's a thread we see throughout Gandhi's life, and it pops up again in a really interesting way with his relationship with Sarala Devi Chaturani.
Oh, yes. Now, there's a fascinating woman, a gifted artist, a writer, and a prominent activist in her own right. Quite a contrast to Kaustubha, Gandhi's wife. The biography mentioned these long conversations they had during Sarala Devi's husband's absence.
It's like a window into the intellectual and emotional world that Gandhi was inhabiting.
I mean, can you imagine Gandhi sitting there debating art and politics with someone like Sarala Devi?
It makes you question whether his views on traditional gender roles were really as rigid as they might seem at first glance.
Definitely adds another layer of complexity to his character. And speaking of complexity, what about his stance on his son Manilal's relationship with a Muslim woman named Fatima?
Oh, right. Gandhi objected to that marriage, but it wasn't because of any personal prejudice against Muslims. He was worried about how it would be perceived by the public and how it could harm the already fragile Hindu-Muslim relations.
So he's thinking strategically, always considering the broader political implications of what might seem like a personal decision.
Exactly. Constantly walking that tightrope, trying to balance his personal beliefs with the strategic needs of the movement. Makes you think about the compromises that leaders often have to make, right? Would you be willing to make those kinds of compromises for a greater cause?
That's a tough question, one I'm not sure I have an answer to. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of Gandhi's political strategies. We see some interesting interactions with Jinnah, who, as we all know, would later become the leader of the Muslim League.
Yes, and even in these early interactions, you can see Gandhi's sharp political mind at work. He actually encouraged Jinnah, who was primarily an English speaker, to learn Gujarati.
Now, why would he do that?
Because Gandhi was smart. He knew that to really achieve independence, they needed to mobilize a much broader base than just the English-speaking elite. And language, well, language was a key to unlocking that support.
It shows you his strategic thinking, his understanding of grassroots mobilization.
Absolutely, and that's something that's still relevant today, right? Think about how politicians use social media to connect with voters. It's all about speaking the language of the people you're trying to reach.
Right, meeting people where they are.
Okay.
Okay, so we're getting a more nuanced picture here. Gandhi, the strategist, the pragmatist, willing to make tough calls and think long-term. But before we move on, I want to touch on his push for Swadeshi, self-reliance, back in 1920.
Another brilliant move, really. Gandhi had this uncanny ability to take seemingly mundane actions and turn them into powerful political statements. He encouraged everyone, ordinary citizens, prominent figures like Jinnah's wife, to start participating in hand-spinning classes.
Wait, Jinnah's wife? Spinning yarn. I don't quite follow the logic there.
It was all about economic independence. By producing their own cloth, Indians could boycott British goods and start to weaken that colonial grip on their economy.
Wow, I mean, who would have thought that something as simple as spinning yarn could become such a potent symbol of resistance? But let's be real, not everyone was on board with Gandhi's approach.
Of course not. Some people thought he was too radical, while others, particularly those with more Marxist leanings, thought he wasn't radical enough.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting for me.
So in 1920, you have this young trade unionist, Shripad Amrit Danj. He publishes a book called Gandhi versus Lenin, and it's a pretty scathing critique.
What was Dange's main argument?
He essentially says that Gandhi's reliance on religion and individual conscience was actually holding back the revolutionary potential of the movement. Dange believed that real change required a more systemic approach, one that focused on class struggle and a redistribution of power.
So even back then, there were these fundamental disagreements about the best path to liberation. And it's fascinating how these debates about individual action versus systemic change are still so relevant today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. These are timeless questions that any movement for social justice has to wrestle with. And I think it's a testament to the enduring relevance of Gandhi's ideas, that they continue to spark such passionate discussion even all these years later.
Now, I can't resist bringing up this little anecdote. From when Gandhi stayed at Kingsley Hall in London during the 1931 Round Table Conference, the biography mentioned these wild rumors that were circulating in the British press, like that he brought Ganges mud with him to make Hindu idols, and that he had goats on the rooftop for milk.
It's almost comical, right? But it shows how Gandhi was often perceived as this eccentric figure in the Western media, both fascinated by him and maybe a little bit mocking of his unconventional lifestyle and beliefs.
Makes you wonder how he navigated those perceptions. Did he play into them or try to challenge them?
It's a great question. I think he did a bit of both, to be honest. He definitely understood the power of image and symbolism, and he wasn't afraid to use his unique persona to draw attention to his cause. But at the same time, he consistently emphasized those universal principles behind his actions, arguing that they went beyond any specific culture or religion.
Okay, so we're seeing Gandhi as a master strategist, a symbol of resistance, even a bit of a media personality, you could say. But let's dive into a more personal, frankly, more controversial aspect of his life, his commitment to celibacy, which was almost monastic in its intensity. What are your thoughts on this part of his life?
Gandhi's views on celibacy were really complex. They were rooted in this idea of brahmacharya, which goes beyond just abstaining from sex. It's about harnessing your sexual energy and channeling it towards spiritual growth and self-control.
That sounds pretty radical, even for that time. What were the reactions to this aspect of his philosophy?
Well, it certainly raised some eyebrows, even among his closest followers. And it gets even more controversial when you consider his brahmacharya experiments later in life, where he would sleep in the same bed as young women as a way to test his self-control.
See, that's the part that I've always struggled to understand. How do we reconcile that practice with the image of Gandhi as a champion of women's rights and empowerment?
It's a difficult question, and there's no easy answer. Some people argue that it was a misguided attempt to show the power of spiritual purity over physical urges. Others see it as coming from his own anxieties about sexuality, and this desire to overcome those desires through these extreme measures.
But you also did think about the power dynamics involved, right? Gandhi was a figure of immense authority, and these young women were often his devoted followers. Did they really have agency in these situations?
That's the crucial point. And it's actually something that Gandhi himself seems to have wrestled with. The biography mentions an incident where he asked a journalist, Sudhir Mukherjee, what he thought about this practice, whether it was right or wrong.
It's almost as if he was looking for some kind of external validation, or maybe grappling with the ethical implications of what he was doing. It definitely adds another layer to the whole debate about his legacy and how we interpret his actions through a modern lens.
Absolutely. It reminds us that even the most revered historical figures had flaws and contradictions. It's not about condoning or condemning, but about trying to understand the context, the motivations, and the impact of their choices.
This whole conversation is making me realize how easy it is to put historical figures on a pedestal. But this deep dive is revealing all those complexities of Gandhi's character, the good, the bad, and everything in between. It's honestly making me question a lot of what I thought I knew about him.
That's the power of digging deeper, of going beyond those surface-level narratives. It forces us to confront our own biases and to engage with history in a more nuanced and critical way.
All right, let's move into the later years of Gandhi's life, the tumultuous period of India's partition. Here we see a man devoted to nonviolence, suddenly confronted with this unimaginable bloodshed and brutality.
It's a heartbreaking irony, isn't it? It really put his philosophy to the test. The biography talks about this chilling incident in 1948, where a bomb exploded near one of Gandhi's prayer meetings.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. It was a refugee, Madan Lal Pawa, who was caught with a hand grenade. What was his motivation?
Pa said he had lost everything during the partition and blamed Gandhi for all the violence and displacement that had happened.
It's a stark reminder of the personal cost of political upheaval, how ideology can be twisted by trauma and loss. And yet, even after this terrifying experience, Gandhi continued his speech, advocating for peace and reconciliation.
That's the resilience, that unwavering commitment that defined him. Even in the face of death, he refused to abandon his principles.
It's both inspiring and incredibly tragic at the same time. It makes you wonder, are there any limits to nonviolence? Are there situations where it's simply not enough?
That's a question that continues to be debated, and I think it's a question each of us has to grapple with on a personal level.
Right.
What are our own limits when it comes to standing up for what we believe in, even in the face of adversity?
That's a heavy question, but an important one. So we've seen Gandhi the strategist, the spiritual seeker, the man grappling with his own personal demons and the political realities of his time. It's a lot to process. Can you help us make sense of it all?
I think if we were to distill some key takeaways from this deep dive so far, it's that Gandhi was a man of profound contradictions. He was this visionary leader who inspired millions, but also a flawed individual who made some questionable choices. He was a master of political strategy, but also this deeply spiritual person, guided by this unwavering belief in nonviolence.
It's incredible how those seemingly opposite forces coexisted within him. It makes me think about how we often try to categorize people as either good or bad, hero or villain, but the reality is just so much more nuanced.
Exactly, and that's what makes studying history so enriching. It's not about memorizing dates and facts. It's about understanding the complexities of human nature and how those complexities shape the course of events.
So we've explored his strengths, his weaknesses, his triumphs, and his failures. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to address one last elephant in the room. That controversial brahmacharya experiment.
Yes, the sleeping with young women to test his self-control. A truly perplexing and to many disturbing aspect of his later years.
It's just so tough to reconcile that practice with the image of Gandhi as a champion of women's rights and empowerment. How do we make sense of that apparent contradiction?
Well, some argue that it stemmed from his own deep-seated anxieties about sexual desire, a struggle that he felt compelled to confront in this very public way. Others see it as this misguided attempt to prove the power of spiritual purity over physical urges.
And yet it's hard to ignore the power dynamics at play. Gandhi held such immense authority, and the young women involved are often his devoted followers.
Indeed, which raises all sorts of questions about consent, agency, and the potential for exploitation regardless of Gandhi's intentions.
And it's interesting that even Gandhi himself seemed to acknowledge that potential for misunderstanding. Remember when he asked that journalist, Sudhir Mukherjee, for his opinion on the whole thing?
Right. It suggests that even he might have been grappling with the ethical implications of his actions.
It's these kinds of contradictions that make studying history so fascinating. Yet at the same time, so challenging. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, to acknowledge the flaws and complexities, even in those we might revere, and to really wrestle with those ethical dilemmas of the past.
Absolutely. It's about trying to understand the context, the motivations, and the impact of human actions, even when those actions challenge our own moral compass.
Well said. This deep dive into Gandhi's life has definitely taken us on a roller coaster ride. Admiration, inspiration, confusion, even a bit of discomfort. But it's definitely left me with a much richer, more nuanced understanding of the man and his legacy.
And isn't that the goal? To move beyond those simplistic narratives and engage with history in all its complexity.
Absolutely. It's about learning, questioning, and ultimately forming our own conclusions about the past and what it means for us in the present.
Well said. And speaking of conclusions, I think we've got time for one final provocative thought before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Bring it on. I'm ready for that final aha moment.
Okay, so consider this. If Gandhi were alive today, how do you think he would respond to the challenges of our modern world? What would he say about climate change, social inequality, political polarization, the rise of technology?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's hard to imagine him staying silent on any of those issues.
Right. And how would his philosophy of nonviolence translate to a world grappling with these new forms of conflict and oppression?
It's a question that's both fascinating and incredibly relevant. It reminds us that while Gandhi might be a center of the past, his ideas and his ideals, they continue to resonate today, challenging us to find new and creative ways to build a more just and peaceful world. It really is mind-boggling to try and picture him in our world today, a world with the internet, smartphones, things he never even could have imagined.
Yeah, it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. But that's where the real challenge and the potential for some really deep insights lies.
Okay, so where do we even begin? The world has changed so much since Gandhi's time.
I think a good starting point would be those core principles that guided his life. Truth, nonviolence, social justice, timeless concepts, but how they'd be applied today, that's the question.
Let's start with truth. We're bombarded with information constantly. It's hard to know what to believe. How do you think Gandhi would navigate this world of fake news and echo chambers?
Well, Gandhi was a huge believer in open dialogue, the importance of hearing different perspectives. He'd probably tell us to be careful about what we read and hear, to question our sources, and to have respectful conversations, even with people we disagree with.
So instead of retreating into our own little bubbles, he'd be pushing us to get out of our comfort zones, to really engage with different viewpoints. It's about seeking truth through dialogue, through really listening to each other, not just clinging to our own beliefs.
Exactly. And it's not just about what we take in. It's about how we communicate. I think he'd be pretty appalled by the level of nastiness of personal attacks we see online and just in general these days.
Like he'd say, can't we disagree without being disagreeable? It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, even when it's tough.
Exactly. And that leads us to the challenge of nonviolence in today's world. It's easy to talk about it as a concept, but how do you actually practice it in a world with war, terrorism, all these forms of oppression?
That's the question that keeps coming up for me. Is nonviolence really a solution? When you're dealing with forces that are so deeply entrenched and often so violent.
I think Gandhi would argue that nonviolence isn't about being passive or weak. It's about active resistance, about refusing to cooperate with injustice, about using moral force to expose and dismantle systems of oppression.
So it's less about never fighting back and more about strategically using every other option before resorting to violence. It's about exhausting all peaceful means to achieve justice.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that violence, even when used with good intentions, often creates more problems than it solves. It's about understanding that we're all connected and working towards solutions that benefit everyone.
Okay, but how would that philosophy apply to something like climate change, where the enemy isn't necessarily a person or a group, but a global crisis that requires everyone to work together?
I think Gandhi would see climate change as the ultimate test of our interconnectedness. He'd probably call for a radical change in our values, moving away from consumerism towards a more sustainable way of living.
Simple living, local economies, a greater respect for nature.
Absolutely. He'd be challenging us to think beyond our own needs, to prioritize the well-being of future generations, to recognize that we're all part of this larger ecosystem, and that our actions have consequences.
And what about social justice? Gandhi dedicated his life to fighting for the marginalized and the oppressed. How do you think he'd respond to the inequalities we see today? The economic disparity, the racial injustice, the gender discrimination.
Gandhi believed that true freedom meant freedom for everyone, not just for a select few. He'd probably be on the front lines of movements demanding equality, calling for a more just distribution of resources and opportunities.
I can see him leading marches, organizing boycotts, amplifying the voices of those who are often silenced. He wouldn't be afraid to challenge the system.
And he'd remind us that social change requires both individual action and collective effort. He'd call on each of us to examine our own biases, to stand up for what's right, and to work together to create a more inclusive and equitable society.
It's pretty inspiring to think about how his legacy could still guide us. It reminds us that even when things seem impossible, we have the power to make a difference.
Gandhi's life and his work are a powerful testament to the potential for human action, when it's guided by principles like truth, nonviolence, and social justice. And while he may belong to the past, his ideas are still incredibly relevant to the challenges we face today.
It's a lot to take in, really trying to apply these ideas to such a different world.
Right. It's not a simple one-to-one translation, but I think the process of trying to grapple with those questions, that's where the real value lies.
Okay, so where do we go from here? We've uncovered all these different facets of Gandhi's life and philosophy, the good, the bad, the complex. What do we do with all this information?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that Gandhi wasn't some perfect saint. He was a human being with strengths and weaknesses, just like all of us.
Right, we can't just put him on a pedestal and ignore the parts that make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. We have to engage with the whole picture, even the messy parts.
And how do we apply his teachings to our own lives? I mean, the world has changed so much since his time.
I think it goes back to those core principles we talked about. Truth, nonviolence, social justice. Those are values that are still relevant today, maybe even more so.
But how do we live those values in a world that often seems so opposed to them?
That's the challenge, right? It's not easy, but I think Gandhi would remind us that even small acts of courage and compassion can make a difference.
So it's not about trying to become Gandhi. It's about finding ways to embody those principles in our own unique ways.
Exactly. It's about asking ourselves those tough questions, like, how can I be more truthful in my interactions? How can I choose nonviolence even when I'm angry or frustrated? How can I work towards a more just world?
Those are questions that each of us has to answer for ourselves. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. It's about finding what works for you in your own life.
Well, this has been quite a journey, exploring the life and legacy of Mahatma Gandhi.
It has.
We've gone beyond the usual saintly image and uncovered a more complex and human figure, someone who wrestled with inner conflicts, navigated challenging political landscapes, and ultimately left an indelible mark on the world.
And even though he's been gone for over 70 years, his ideas still have the power to challenge us, to inspire us, and to guide us as we strive to build a more just and peaceful world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought. What aspect of Gandhi's life or philosophy resonated with you the most? And how can you bring those insights into your own life? Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Thanks for tuning in to The Thinking Shelf. We hope today's episode gave you some valuable insights that can help you grow. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay focused, stay intentional, and keep thinking deeply